All right. We're at a great moment here. We are about to start animating our layers. This is really exciting. This is truly where I think the level of enthusiasm and excitement really starts to spark with new motion graphic artists and animators. Going to start off super basic, just like everything, nice and slow, baby steps. But you're gonna see how this works, and ideas are gonna start sparking in your head about where you can take this in your own direction with your own work. This is where it all starts, people. It's really awesome. Okay, you can download this project from the website. It's just 2 solids, or you can make it yourself. That's good practice. I got a background solid that is creamy, and then I've got this nice purple square, 400 by 400. Very simple setup. Like I said, it's good practice. I locked my background layer just so that we don't mess with it. We're going to focus just on the square right now. So I select the square, and I want to look at those transform attributes. The first one that we're going to animate is going to be position. I want to show you a very useful shortcut. Obviously, we know we can kick down all those little... God, I got to figure out what the name is for that little triangle thing. Like I said last time, I used to call it something. I think that's what everyone was calling it, but I just haven't had to call it anything in like years. So it's just the little fly out menu. Anyways, if I turn that back up and I don't have anything shown and I want to access position, I can hit P on my keyboard and it opens up position. That way I'm not having to clutter my space. It's valuable space. Our screens are valuable space. Some of you have a big screen. Some of you have 2 big screens. In my office at the university, I've got 2 big screens. Man, I still find that space to be precious and valuable. So to minimize clutter is really great. P, position. If I hit P again, it goes away. Okay, so what about scale? S. Scale, S on the keyboard. Bam, there's scale. What about rotation? R for rotation. Kind of making sense, right? So now I can just access rotation with the press of a button. What about opacity? You would think it's O, but it's not. They threw a curveball for us. But the way to think about it is opacity. Or transparency, which it isn't called, but it's opacity. T for opacity. If I click O, it goes to the end of my timeline, which is out for my out point, and I for my in point. So you can hit O and I, and that'll take you to the beginning and the end of your timeline. That's what happens if you press O. T, opacity, R, rotation, S, scale, P for position, and A for anchor point. If you want to get 2 of those things up at the same time, let's say we want to just focus on position and scale, you hit P and then Shift S, and now you've got those 2. So that's kind of cool. Get used to it, play with it, hit those buttons, write it down, put it on a sticky note. That's how we learn. I'm just going to deal with position right now, though. Okay, my position currently, as usual, when you introduce a new layer to your composition, almost always, there are exceptions, plops it right down in the center of your composition. So there again, I see my coordinates 960 by 540, half of 1920, half of 1080. Cool. I want to move this thing from left to right. So I need to move it over to the left-hand side of the screen. I can do that however I want to. I can grab it on the canvas and move it. I can use my coordinates and slide those back and forth, or I can type in something. Do it however you want. I'm just going to grab it and I'm going to slide it over, but I'm going to hold shift just so I'm still at the same Y value. I'm just going to pop it over here on the left edge, a little bit of room, give it some breathing room. So that's where this now resides. It now resides at this moment in time at this position, this coordinate. Piece of cake. Now the animation part ends up getting a little tricky with a process that is not totally intuitive if you haven't dealt with keyframing before. Keyframing comes from a term from traditional animation where if you were a keyframer, you would only draw special parts of the action, and then the in-betweeners were other artists who would go in and fill in what those other frames look like to get from this part of a walk or this part of an action to another action or position. So the keyframe comes from traditional animation, and it's nice that they still use that because it's relative. I am going to be basing my movements on keyframes in sort of key positions or key states of change. Then After Effects will end up being the in-betweener for me. Nice. Thanks for all that hard work, program. Okay, so I have to think about two important properties in order to animate: time and value. In this case, my value is a coordinate, but a value could be a rotation degree or an opacity percentage scale value. So that's number one. And number two is time. Time is critical for an animator or motion graphic artist. You got to think about time and how movement will play into that time. How long something might take to happen, how quickly something might need to change. If you're trying to coordinate movements with audio and so on, time and these sort of cues is really critical. So right now, my time is frame 0. I'm not advanced at any time. I'm just at the beginning of time. This is the dawn of time. And I know this by either looking at my time code in my timeline window, or the time code in my composition window, or where my little playhead is, the current time indicator. And I can grab that and slide it. And as I slide it, you can see that the time code is changing. I've got a 5-second composition. And I can scrub anywhere between frame 0 and my last frame, which is 4 seconds, 29 frames. Why isn't it 5 if it's a 5-second composition? Because they include frame 0 as a frame, so that makes up for the full 30 frames for every second. I'm going back to frame 0. And I need to tell After Effects that, hey, at frame 0, this is where I want my square to be. Would you please record this information? And then you have to do something. And that something is initiating the keyframe process by clicking on the stopwatch, which is this little icon next to the attribute position. Every attribute has them. Even in effects and special things that we'll be doing to our layers later, they all have a stopwatch. Well, most of them do. The stopwatch says, hey, all right, After Effects, I'm ready to animate. So pay attention to what I'm doing. So you click on it. That little stopwatch turns blue. I see a little blue diamond on the very left of my layer attribute for position. I don't know what just happened. I just somehow undid that with a button on my stylus. So there's a little blue diamond, and then the most important blue diamond is the one that's in the timeline. So right here I can see a little blue diamond at frame 0, and that blue diamond is a stamp of recorded material saying, hey, at this moment in time we're at 249 and 540, X and Y. Great. Now in order to get change in movement, I need to deal with those two properties that I talked about earlier, which is time and coordinate in this case, or value. So if I said by the end of this 5 seconds, and I go to the very end, I want this square to be on the right-hand side of things. What is important to know is that you never click that stopwatch button ever again unless you want to just nuke everything that you've done and start all over. The stopwatch is only used once to initiate the animation process. From that point on, it's all recording what you're going to do. It's like it's waiting for you to do and change something, and it'll lay down keyframes for you automatically, it being After Effects. It'll it'll record and stamp these different moments of change anywhere along the timeline as long as you move your playhead or change your time and then change the actual coordinate or value. So I changed my time to be at the end of the timeline, and now I'm just going to grab that square and move it across to the other side, and I see some visual indicators that I am successful here. The first one is that there's now a line that goes from the left side of the screen to the right, and it has all these little dots on it. Well, those dots represent frames in time, and that's cool. Now I see that there's another blue diamond in my timeline. There are two diamonds, and it's only blue because it's currently selected. If I clicked off of it, it'll turn gray or white, whatever that is. It's just lighter value. So now I have 2 keyframes in my timeline that are recording different information. If I click back on that solid, it'll highlight it and show me that path. I just want to leave that on for a second. If I scrub through time now, you can see that that square has just traveled from point A to point B as frame 0 to frame 4 seconds, 29 frames. And it's a nice, uniform, straight path because I held down shift and it's just a whoosh, lateral move. That's awesome. These keyframes here are the recorded information about that value for position. The keyframes themselves land wherever that playhead was. So if I hit undo, and that keyframe is now gone, it's just only the first one is recording, and I went to like halfway, which would be like 2:15, or would it be 2:14? Probably be 2:14. Doesn't matter. Now I do the same thing and I move it over here. It recorded that information at this point in time, which is half the amount of time that my original animation took, which means it's going to move twice as fast. So velocity is based on distance and time, right? So now it's half of the time, same distance, which means it's going to travel faster. And you can kind of, you can't tell this because I'm scrubbing. We'll show you how to do a preview here in a second. So it's the same movement, only it's happening at a faster rate. And then nothing's happening because there's no other information for it down the road. It just goes and stops. That's fine. Sometimes we have animation that does that. So I can have as many keyframes in a timeline as I want for any particular attribute. We'll get more complicated with multiple keyframes here in a bit. But I do want you to know that keyframes are not locked in time. They are movable. So I can grab a keyframe in the timeline and I can move it. And I can say, oh, I actually do want this at the end. And I can put it at the end of my timeline. Or I could say, actually, it needs to be faster, and I want it in 1 second. And so now you can see that the distance between all of these frames is greater. That means it has to travel a greater distance between frames, which means it's going to be traveling even faster to get to where it is. So it travels that far, the same point, the same distance, but now only in 1 second. So keyframes can be moved. You can also double click on a keyframe and you can put in its values. So I double clicked on a position keyframe and it says, all right, what do you want X to be and what do you want Y to be? And well, my X is this, but what happens if I say I want Y to be 250? Well, now I just changed the path that I originally did by moving the square, but I did it with a coordinate from the keyframe. Wow, it's going to get a little heavy and pretty overloading information-wise, but look, now I'm moving up. So I can change my path that way, or I can go back to the original keyframe, and this is really tricky, and you got to listen to me because this is where everyone always screws up. You're not paying attention to where your time is. You got to pay attention to where your time is. I want to go back to that first keyframe, which means I have to make sure my playhead is back at frame 0. So I go back to frame 0. How do I know I'm on my keyframe? I look over here on the left-hand side, and I get that little diamond that is blue. The second that I go off of that time, that diamond is no longer blue. It's empty, which means there is no recorded information for that time. So if I said, I want to go back to the beginning, but I don't quite go there, and then I changed my value by like dragging, you can see that now I've just added a third point, and that might not be your intention. I'm going to hit undo. So make sure you go all the way back to where that keyframe is. If you want to know and guarantee that you're on a keyframe, there are these little arrow buttons which are advanced to the next or previous keyframe buttons. So I click on the next keyframe. It guarantees me that my playhead is going to go land right where that keyframe is. So now I can make my adjustments and not end up having all this crazy keyframe garbage in there. Stay away from keyframe garbage. It's going to make your animations look terrible. So this is a good time to pay attention. Put it in your head. You need to put it in your head. I know it sounds so silly, but I see it all the time, every year. Bundles of keyframes around one moment because no one's paying attention to that specific time and keyframe where you want to go. So now I can go back to frame 0. So these little guys are really handy. You can also use the shift button on your keyboard and it'll snap to time. So you can see how it sort of snaps to the keyframes that I've laid down. Super handy. Okay, now position has other attributes to it that we'll get into a little bit later. Right now I just want to move through some of these other animated properties. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to click on my stopwatch for position because I don't want any keyframes anymore. So this is the only time you would do a second click on the stopwatch if you say, all right, that was fun, but I'm not going to do that. So I just clicked on it, keyframes are gone, there's no more movement, the movement has been completely erased. Of course you can undo, but there's a nice little thing I can do where I can right click on position and hit reset, and it puts it right back to where it originally was as intended. So that's handy. Now I'm going to go to scale. Scale can be recorded as well. So I'm making sure I'm at frame 0. I'm going to click the stopwatch for scale, saying, hey, all right, After Effects, pay attention to what I do. And I'm going to go to my 2.5 mark again. And I'm going to change the scale. And you can do this several ways. You can do it through the coordinates here on the timeline, or I can grab the corner handles and make a scale change. Grabbing the handles on the canvas means that you will break the link between X and Y value. If you want to maintain that link, then you're best off just changing the value here. It does it uniformly. But if I grab a corner handle and start just sort of free-forming, you can see that it allows you to move it however you want. I'll hit undo, and if I grab a top or bottom, it does just constrain it to the Y or the X. So I'm going to hit undo and undo. Back to normal, back to 100%. So I've set my first keyframe at 100% as frame 0. I'm going halfway through to 215, and now I'm going to just change my scale to 40%. And we can see that we've just scaled from 100 to 40 halfway through my comp. Now what if I want to go big and I want to end my animation with something larger? I'll just go to the end of my timeline now, and I'll change this to, I don't know, I'll just fill the whole screen up. So it's about 490%. Now if I just look over the time here, we start at 100, we scale down to 40, and then we grow fast to almost 500% to fill the screen. So there's a little more of a choreographed move where I've got 3 keyframes now. First recorded at 100, second at 40, and last at about 500, spread over time. So get used to laying down multiple keyframes. The other cool thing is that if you go, man, I really don't like the way it shrinks, I just want to go from 100 to 500. You can select that keyframe in the timeline that's in the middle and just hit delete on your keyboard and it's gone. So now you have new instructions saying, let's go from the first recording at 100 to 500. Somehow I just took that corner of my window. And you just have one fluid move. You can interrupt that at any time in the middle of your timeline and say, well, actually at 1 second, I would like it to be super small. And now I've just changed that information again, so it's going to go down and then bounce up and get big. So you can introduce keyframes at any time during your animation. You can delete keyframes at any time during animation, but you need at least 2 keyframes in order to have any animation happen. Recorded state, change of time, recorded state. So keep that in mind. You got to have at least 2. No animation can happen with just 1 keyframe. I'll get rid of that little guy. So right now I've just been dragging over the change and seeing it. What happens, or how do I preview this? Several ways you can preview this. There is a preview window you can open up, or there is composition preview, and you can hit play current preview, which is the same as hitting this button right here, which is the play and stop button, which is also spacebar on your keyboard. So pick your poison. I'm just going to hit spacebar, and it'll go through and play your animation for you at real time once it renders. So I don't know if you noticed, but at first, I'll change this value just so we can start over. There's only a green dot at frame 0 and a green dot at my last frame. This is rendered images. Rendered images means that your computer is saving that picture of 1 frame in your computer in temporary space, either RAM or on your disk cache. And it needs to record and save all of those frames in order for it to play back to you. So if I hit spacebar, you can see that green bar grows, and what it's doing, it's taking each frame and its state of change and recording it in your computer, and then it allows it to play back at full speed and shows you your animation. So that's what's happening. It's they used to call it a RAM preview, but now it's just preview because they use all parts of your computer for it, not just the RAM. So that's pretty handy. Spacebar. Okay, so that's how you preview your stuff. I'm gonna get rid of my scale keyframes, and I'm gonna move to rotation. Rotation, this is where, again, you need to set your stopwatch to say, hey, I'm recording my rotation now, and at frame 0, I'm gonna be at 0 degrees. And by 5 seconds, I would like to go 180 degrees, so just a complete flip, one upside down flip. If I hit spacebar, we'll watch it go, and it's usually always slow on the first run, then a little faster on the second because it's trying to build those frames. So there's my 5 seconds of just going from a half revolution, 180 degrees. It almost looks like it's a continuous speed since it loops. It just kind of, since it's a square, you know what I'm getting at. So I could do that, or I'm going to delete that last keyframe, and I'm going to go back to frame 429, and I'm going to do revolutions this time. So instead of a degree change, I say, what if I want to go 3 revolutions? That means it's going to do 3 full 360s in 5 seconds. So now if I watch it, it's going to spin a whole lot faster. Let it go. And there it is at full speed. So there's 3 full revolutions in 5 seconds. That's pretty cool. So that's how you keyframe your rotation. I will just go back to frame 0, turn my keyframes off, and we'll do opacity. And you can imagine what opacity is. It's recording your opacity, saying maybe halfway through I want to go from 100% opacity to 0, so it's fully transparent. And then at the end, I'll come back to 100%. And now if I watch that, it just goes, it fades away and then fades back on. And with a loop, it just kind of looks like it's breathing in and out. So that is keyframing basics on all of those properties. We just didn't do anchor point. I tend not to. There's times where we'll get into the anchor point a little bit later. But right now, just ignore it. Unless you need to rotate something from a different axis, which, like I said, we'll get into that later. Okay, practice. Please practice. It's the only way to get over some of these big hurdles, which looks so simple. But I'll tell you what, people who are getting started with motion graphics, especially After Effects right here, stumble big time on keyframes. Make sure you master this. It's going to save your butt down the road. Guarantee it. Okay, we'll get into some heavier animation in our next film. Thanks. Bye.